Some people attend funerals to mourn. Others attend to make sure their victim is really dead. Marcus Bennett sat in Courtroom 4B of the Denver County Courthouse on this cold October morning, his hands folded perfectly in his lap, creating the image of a man consumed by quiet grief. His navy blue suit was pressed to perfection, his tie slightly loosened in a way that suggested he'd been pulling at it nervously, a calculated detail he'd practiced in the mirror that morning. To everyone around him, he was the devastated boyfriend, the man who had lost everything when Sarah Chin vanished 6 months ago from their shared apartment in Boulder, Colorado. He'd chosen his seat carefully, close enough to Sarah's family to appear supportive, but positioned where he could watch the entire courtroom. His eyes, a cold gray that he'd learned to soften when necessary, scanned the room methodically. Every detail mattered. Every expression, every gesture had to be perfect. He'd been playing this role for 182 days now, and he'd become quite good at it. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Marcus noticed how the dust particles danced in those beams of light, and he thought about Sarah. About how she'd looked that night, the life leaving her eyes as his hands tightened around her throat. About how those same eyes had stared at nothing when he checked her pulse, or lack thereof. About the satisfaction he'd felt knowing his plan was working perfectly. The worst monsters don't hide in shadows. They sit beside you at the dinner table, share your coffee, and kiss you goodnight before they kill you. Sarah's mother, Patricia Chin, sat 3 seats away from Marcus, clutching a photograph of her daughter so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The photo showed Sarah at her nursing school graduation, her smile bright and full of hope for the future. A future that Marcus had stolen. Patricia's eyes were red and swollen from months of crying, her face aged by grief in ways that no mother should ever have to experience. She didn't know that the man she'd invited to sit with the family, the man she'd comforted when he broke down crying at the police station, the man she'd made dinner for when he looked too thin and devastated to care for himself, had strangled her daughter with his bare hands in their kitchen on March 14, 2024, at approximately 11:47 p.m. Patricia had no idea that Marcus had held Sarah down on their kitchen floor, pressing his thumbs into her windpipe while she clawed at his arms, her nursing training making her fight harder because she knew exactly what was happening to her body. She didn't know that her daughter's last thoughts were of her, of the phone call they'd had that morning about Patricia's upcoming birthday dinner. Marcus had attended every family gathering since Sarah's disappearance. He'd held Patricia while she sobbed. He'd helped Sarah's father, Thomas Chin, put up missing person flyers all over Boulder and Denver. He'd given interviews to local news stations, his voice breaking at all the right moments, begging for Sarah's safe return. He'd even started a GoFundMe for the reward money, making sure to donate the first $1,000 himself. The other family members, Sarah's younger brother David, her aunt Linda, her cousin Michelle, they all saw Marcus as a victim too. They included him in their grief support group. They prayed with him. They never noticed the moments when his mask slipped, when his eyes went cold and calculating before he remembered to look sad again. Killers don't just take lives. They steal futures, destroy families, and walk among us wearing masks of humanity so perfect that we invite them into our homes and hearts. Detective James Morrison had worked the Chin case for 176 days, and every single one of them haunted him. At 53 years old, with 28 years on the Denver Police Department, he'd worked hundreds of missing person cases. But something about Sarah Chen's disappearance had gotten under his skin from day one. No body. No witnesses. No evidence. Just a missing 28-year-old nurse who'd vanished after her shift at Denver General Hospital on March 14. She'd clocked out at 11:15 p.m., walked to her car in the employee parking lot, captured on security camera, and then nothing. Her car had been found the next morning in the parking lot of their Boulder apartment complex, her purse inside, her keys in the ignition. Marcus had been questioned 7 times. Detective Morrison had brought him in personally for each interview, watching his body language, listening for inconsistencies in his story. But Marcus's alibi was airtight, or so it seemed. He'd been at a business dinner in Colorado Springs that night, with 3 colleagues who'd all confirmed he was there from 7 p.m. until midnight. They'd provided receipts, photos, even a video of Marcus giving a toast at 11:30 p.m. But Morrison's gut told him something was wrong. He'd seen the way Marcus positioned himself in Sarah's family photos. He'd noticed how Marcus always steered conversations about Sarah's mental state, subtly suggesting she'd been depressed, that she'd talked about running away. He documented how Marcus had pushed for Sarah to be declared dead after just 4 months, citing financial hardship with the apartment lease. The detective had spent countless hours reviewing security footage, interviewing Sarah's co-workers and friends, searching for any crack in Marcus's facade. Sarah's best friend, Jennifer Wu, had told Morrison that Sarah had seemed scared in the weeks before she disappeared. She'd mentioned that Marcus had been acting possessive, showing up at the hospital unannounced, tracking her phone location obsessively. But scared wasn't proof. Possessive wasn't evidence. And without a body, without witnesses, without any physical evidence linking Marcus to Sarah's disappearance, Morrison's hands were tied. The district attorney had refused to bring charges, saying they barely had enough for an arrest warrant, let alone a conviction. So Morrison kept digging. He'd gone through Marcus's financial records, his phone logs, his social media. He discovered that Marcus had searched for how long until missing person declared dead and life insurance beneficiary rights on his laptop, but Marcus's lawyer had argued those searches were normal for someone desperate to find closure and dealing with financial uncertainty. Every night, Morrison went home to his wife and told her about the case he couldn't solve, about the woman he couldn't find, about the killer he knew was guilty but couldn't prove it. Justice isn't blind. Sometimes it's handcuffed by the very laws designed to protect the innocent, while the guilty walk free. Today wasn't supposed to be about Sarah Chin at all. Courtroom 4B had been scheduled for a preliminary hearing in an unrelated fraud case, a case involving a local real estate developer accused of embezzling funds from elderly investors. The courtroom was filling up with attorneys, defendants, family members of victims, and court officials preparing for what was expected to be a routine morning of legal proceedings. But Patricia Chin had insisted on being there anyway, and she'd brought her family with her. She'd heard that prosecutor Elizabeth Harmon would be in this courtroom, and Patricia needed, to speak with her about reopening Sarah's case. New evidence, Patricia had been told by a victim's advocate, could sometimes emerge months after a disappearance. She clung to that hope like a lifeline. Marcus had volunteered to drive her from Boulder to Denver. "Of course I'll take you," he'd said on the phone the night before, his voice full of manufactured sympathy. "Sarah would want me to support you. We're family, Patricia. We're all each other has now." What Patricia didn't know was that Marcus had his own reasons for attending court that day. His lawyer, Richard Dawson, had another client with a hearing scheduled in the same courthouse, and Marcus needed to discuss his own legal strategy. There were civil matters to address: Sarah's life insurance policy, the apartment lease, joint credit cards. Marcus was growing impatient with the waiting period, eager to move forward with having Sarah declared legally dead so he could collect what he considered his rightful compensation for all the planning and risk he'd taken. They'd arrived early at 8:30 a.m., and Marcus had bought Patricia coffee from the courthouse cafe, making sure to choose the vanilla latte Sarah had always ordered. It was a calculated gesture, one that made Patricia's eyes fill with tears and her hand squeeze his arm gratefully. These small manipulations had become second nature to Marcus. The way he'd brush his hand over his eyes as if wiping away tears, the way he'd pause before saying Sarah's name as if it physically pained him, the way he'd stare at Patricia's photo of Sarah with what appeared to be longing but was actually pride in his own handiwork. Now they sat in the gallery waiting for the proceedings to begin. The courtroom smelled of old wood polish and the faint traces of too many bodies in too small a space. The American flag hung in the corner, and the Colorado state seal was mounted behind the judge's bench. Marcus counted the ceiling tiles, a habit he'd developed during his previous court appearances, and mentally reviewed his schedule for the rest of the day. Richard Dawson sat in the back row, pretending not to know Marcus but maintaining visual contact. They'd agreed not to acknowledge each other publicly, maintaining the appearance that Marcus was simply a grieving boyfriend supporting his lost love's family, not a client strategizing with his attorney about how to profit from murder. Sometimes the most evil acts are committed in the most mundane places. Courtrooms built for justice become stages for injustice. And predators blend into crowds of victims so seamlessly that no one sees the wolf among the sheep. Marcus checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. 9:47 a.m. The hearing was supposed to begin at 9:30, but Judge Catherine Wells hadn't yet taken the bench. He felt a small flutter of irritation, not because of the delay itself, but because waiting meant maintaining his grieving boyfriend persona for longer, and the mask was starting to feel heavy this morning. He'd been playing this role for 6 months now, and the strain was showing in small ways only he could detect. The slight tension in his jaw. The way his fingers drummed against his knee before he remembered to stop. The momentary blankness in his eyes when someone said Sarah's name, because for just a second, he forgot he was supposed to react with pain instead of satisfaction. His lawyer, Richard Dawson, sat in the back row exactly where they'd arranged. Dawson was one of the best criminal defense attorneys in Colorado, though Marcus hadn't officially hired him for anything criminal yet. Officially, Dawson was helping Marcus navigate the complicated civil matters surrounding Sarah's disappearance. Unofficially, Dawson had been carefully preparing for the possibility that Marcus might eventually face questioning or even charges, though they both believed that was increasingly unlikely as time passed. They exchanged a brief glance. Nothing obvious, just a quick eye contact that communicated everything they needed to say. Everything was going according to plan. Sarah's body was buried deep in the Rocky Mountain National Forest, in a location so remote that Marcus had to hike 3 miles off-trail to reach it. She was wrapped in industrial plastic, the kind used for construction that left no fibers, and covered by 3 feet of concrete he'd poured himself, working through the night by the light of a headlamp. He'd been meticulous. He'd worn a full Tyvek suit during the burial, gloves, and a hairnet. He'd burned the suit afterward in a barrel, letting the ashes scatter in a river 30 miles away. He'd sanitized every tool, every surface, every possible point of contact. The concrete had been mixed on-site using materials purchased from 4 different hardware stores across 3 different counties, always paying in cash, always wearing a baseball cap that obscured his face from security cameras. Marcus allowed himself a moment of pride as he thought about the planning. He'd spent 18 months preparing for Sarah's murder, studying forensic investigation techniques, watching documentaries about cold cases, learning from others' mistakes. He'd created the perfect crime, and every day that passed without an arrest confirmed his genius. The burial site itself was brilliant. It was in a section of national forest that had been damaged by wildfire 3 years ago, where the landscape was constantly changing due to erosion and new growth. Even if someone somehow knew the general area to search, the specific location would be nearly impossible to pinpoint. And without a body there was no murder case. Just a missing person who might have run away, might have been abducted, might be anywhere in the world. The arrogance of a killer is often what destroys them. They spend so much time admiring their own cleverness that they stop watching for the threats they never saw coming. At 9:51 a.m., the bailiff appeared from the judge's chambers and whispered something to the court clerk, a middle-aged woman named Deborah Santos who'd worked in the Denver County Courthouse for 23 years. Marcus watched idly as Deborah's eyebrows rose slightly, and she picked up her phone, speaking quietly into the receiver. Something was happening, though Marcus couldn't tell what. He noticed Detective Morrison sitting near the back of the courtroom. Not unusual, as Morrison often attended court proceedings for various cases. But Morrison's body language had changed. He'd straightened in his seat, his attention suddenly focused on the clerk's desk. Patricia Chin was oblivious to the subtle shifts in the courtroom's energy. She was looking at her phone, scrolling through old photos of Sarah, a ritual of pain she performed dozens of times a day. Beside her, Sarah's father Thomas sat with his eyes closed, either praying or simply trying to escape into his own mind for a few moments of peace. The bailiff walked to the back of the courtroom and opened the door, speaking to someone in the hallway. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw the bailiff's expression, confusion mixed with something that might have been excitement or concern, he couldn't tell which. Judge Catherine Wells finally emerged from her chambers at 9:53 a.m. She was a stern woman in her early 60s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses hanging on a chain around her neck. She'd been on the bench for 15 years and had a reputation for running an efficient courtroom with zero tolerance for nonsense. But as she took her seat and the bailiff called the court to order, Marcus noticed something odd. Judge Wells wasn't looking at her case files. Instead, she was reading a note the clerk had just handed her, and her expression was one Marcus had never seen on a judge's face before: genuine confusion mixed with disbelief. She read the note twice, then looked up at the courtroom gallery, her eyes scanning the faces as if searching for someone specific. Her gaze passed over Marcus without pausing, and he felt a small sense of relief. Whatever this distraction was, it had nothing to do with him. Judge Wells cleared her throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice uncertain in a way that was completely out of character, "we have an unusual situation developing. I've been informed that a witness has arrived. A witness we weren't expecting for a case that wasn't on today's docket." The courtroom stirred with confused murmurs. Patricia looked up from her phone, bewildered. Marcus felt a tiny prickle of unease but dismissed it. This was probably some mix-up with the fraud case, some last-minute testimony that hadn't been properly scheduled. "This is highly irregular," Judge Wells continued, looking at her clerk for confirmation, "but I've been assured by the district attorney's office that this witness's testimony is time-sensitive and critically important. I'm going to allow a brief recess while we sort out the proper protocol. Sometimes the universe sends warnings and whispers before it screams. The wise listen. The arrogant dismiss them." The courtroom doors were closed, but Marcus could hear activity in the hallway beyond. Footsteps, muffled voices, what sounded like multiple people moving with purpose. His unease grew from a prickle to something more substantial, though he still couldn't identify why. He told himself he was being paranoid, that 6 months of constant vigilance had made him jumpy. Detective Morrison had stood up and was walking toward the front of the courtroom, speaking quietly with one of the prosecutors. Marcus watched this interaction carefully. Morrison's face showed something Marcus recognized from their many interrogation sessions: that look of intense focus the detective got when he thought he was close to breaking a case. Richard Dawson caught Marcus's eye from the back row, a question in his expression. Marcus gave a tiny shake of his head. He didn't know what was happening either. Patricia Chin leaned over to Marcus. "Do you think this has anything to do with Sarah?" she asked, hope making her voice shake. "Maybe they found something?" Marcus forced his face into a mask of gentle sympathy, though his mind was racing through possibilities. "I don't know, Patricia. Let's not get our hopes up too high. It's probably just a scheduling issue." But even as he said it, he knew something was wrong. The energy in the courtroom had shifted. The prosecutors were gathering in a cluster, speaking urgently. Additional court security officers had appeared, stationing themselves at strategic positions. This wasn't normal procedure for a witness arrival, even an unexpected one. Judge Wells was on her phone now, and Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders. When she hung up, she exchanged a long look with the lead prosecutor, Elizabeth Harmon, who just entered the courtroom from a side door. "Your Honor," Harmon said, approaching the bench, "I apologize for the disruption to your schedule. What we're about to present is extraordinary, and I want to ensure we follow proper procedure. The witness who's arrived is material to an ongoing investigation. She's come forward with evidence and testimony that will have significant implications for a missing person case that's been active for 6 months." Patricia Chin grabbed Marcus's arm so hard it hurt. "Sarah?" she whispered. "They found Sarah." Marcus's heart began to pound, but he kept his expression neutral. They couldn't have found Sarah's body, it was impossible. He'd been too careful, too thorough. Even if someone had somehow stumbled onto the burial site, which was astronomically unlikely, it would take forensic teams days to excavate and identify remains. This couldn't be about Sarah. "The witness," Judge Wells said carefully, "are they in the hallway now?" "Yes, Your Honor." "She's accompanied by FBI agent Linda Torres and attorneys from the Victim Advocacy Program. She's prepared to provide testimony under oath regarding an attempted homicide." The word "attempted" registered in Marcus's brain, but he was still processing, still telling himself this was about some other case, some other victim. "This is most irregular," Judge Wells said again, but Marcus could hear the curiosity in her voice. "But given the serious nature of the allegations, I'm going to allow this witness to be heard. Bailiff, please bring in the witness." The courtroom fell completely silent. Every eye turned toward the double doors at the back. Patricia Chen was half standing, her hand still gripping Marcus's arm. Marcus could feel his own pulse in his throat, his mouth going dry, though he still didn't know why. The doors opened slowly, and through them came a woman flanked by 2 FBI agents and a victim advocate. The woman was thinner than Marcus remembered, her hair shorter and dyed a darker brown, but there was no mistaking those eyes, those unmistakable brown eyes that he'd watched go empty and lifeless on his kitchen floor 6 months ago. Sometimes the dead refuse to stay silent. And sometimes they don't stay dead at all. Through those doors walked Sarah Chin, alive and breathing, her eyes locked directly onto Marcus Bennett's face. The world seemed to stop spinning for Marcus Bennett. Every sound in the courtroom faded to a dull roar, like his head had been plunged underwater. His vision tunneled until all he could see was Sarah. Sarah, who was supposed to be dead, who he'd strangled and buried and covered with concrete, who couldn't possibly be standing there, alive, breathing, walking toward the witness stand with steady, purposeful steps. His hands, which had been folded calmly in his lap, began to shake. He tried to control it, but the trembling spread up his arms, through his chest, until his entire body felt like it was vibrating at a frequency only he could feel. His carefully constructed mask, the grieving boyfriend, the devastated partner, shattered into 1,000 pieces. "No," he whispered so quietly that only he could hear it. "No, no, no, no." Sarah was thinner than she'd been 6 months ago, probably 15 or 20 pounds lighter. Her face had a gauntness to it that spoke of hard times, of suffering and survival. The hair was definitely different. She'd been a natural black, but now it was dyed a deep brown and cut short in a pixie style that changed her entire appearance. But those eyes, those brown eyes that had pleaded with him for mercy in their kitchen, were exactly the same. And they were looking at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Not fear. Not love. Not even hatred. It was something far more powerful. The look of someone who'd clawed their way out of hell specifically to drag their demon down with them. Patricia Chen's scream shattered the silence. "Sarah." The photo slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor, glass cracking as it hit. "Sarah. Oh my God, Sarah." Patricia was running before anyone could stop her, stumbling over her own feet in her desperation to reach her daughter. Thomas Chen was right behind her, tears already streaming down his face. David, Sarah's younger brother, stood frozen in shock for 3 full seconds before his brain processed what his eyes were seeing, and he too began moving toward his sister. The FBI agents escorting Sarah stepped aside to let Patricia through, and mother and daughter collided in an embrace so fierce that they both nearly fell. Patricia's sobs echoed through the courtroom, raw and primal, the sound of a mother who'd been living in hell getting her child back from the dead. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice breaking as she held her mother. "Mom, I'm here. I'm okay. I'm here." Thomas wrapped his arms around both of them, and David joined the family huddle, all of them crying and holding each other like they'd never let go again. The entire courtroom watched this reunion with a mixture of shock and awe, many with tears in their own eyes. But Sarah's eyes, even as she held her family, never left Marcus. Resurrection isn't always spiritual. Sometimes it's pure, calculated survival. And sometimes it comes with a thirst for justice that won't be denied. Marcus Bennett stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor with a sound like a scream. Every eye in the courtroom that wasn't focused on Sarah's family reunion snapped to him. His face had gone from pale to an ashen gray, the color of someone in the throes of a heart attack or profound shock. "This isn't possible," he said, his voice too loud in the emotional silence. "This isn't, she can't be." Richard Dawson, his lawyer, was moving quickly down the aisle from the back row, his expression a mixture of alarm and professional panic. He grabbed Marcus's arm, leaning in close to hiss in his ear. "Sit down. Don't say another word. Not one single word, Marcus. Do you understand me?" But Marcus jerked his arm away, his eyes still fixed on Sarah. "I checked. he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. I checked her pulse. She wasn't breathing. I made sure. Marcus. Dawson's voice was sharp now, urgent. Shut up. Right now. Detective Morrison was already moving forward from the back of the courtroom, his hand instinctively going to the handcuffs on his belt. 28 years of police work had taught him to recognize a confession when he heard one, even an accidental one. Marcus Bennett had just said enough to justify immediate detention. Judge Wells banged her gavel, but the courtroom was already in chaos. Sarah's family was still crying and holding her. Several other people in the gallery were on their phones, no doubt calling loved ones or posting to social media about what they were witnessing. Court officers were trying to restore order while simultaneously watching Marcus Bennett, recognizing the security threat he potentially represented. Order. Judge Wells commanded. I will have order in this court, or I will clear this room. Marcus sank back into his seat, but it wasn't compliance. It was the collapse of a man whose entire world had just imploded. His hands covered his face, and through his fingers came a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Everything he'd planned, everything he'd executed with such precision, had been for nothing. Sarah Chin was alive. The question that hammered through his brain, drowning out even Dawson's urgent whispered instructions, was simple. How? How had she survived? He'd strangled her until she went limp, until her pulse disappeared under his fingertips. He'd waited 5 full minutes, checking and rechecking, before he'd moved her body to the storage container in his truck. He'd been certain, absolutely certain, that she was dead. What had he missed? What had gone wrong? And more terrifyingly, what did Sarah know? What could she prove? The confession of silence. Sometimes what a person doesn't say reveals more than any words could. And sometimes words slip out in moments of shock that a lifetime of lawyers couldn't take back. Prosecutor Elizabeth Harmon approached the witness stand, her expression gentle but professional. She'd interviewed Sarah 3 times in preparation for this moment, and she knew the trauma that this testimony would require the young woman to relive. Miss Chin, Harmon began, can you please tell the court what happened on the evening of March 14, 2024? Sarah took a deep breath. The courtroom was absolutely silent, every person leaning forward to hear every word. I was working the evening shift at Denver General Hospital, Sarah began. I'm a registered nurse in the emergency department. My shift ended at 11 p.m., and I clocked out at 11:15 p.m. after finishing my patient notes. I drove from the hospital to the apartment I shared with Marcus Bennett in Boulder. Her voice was steady, clinical, almost as if she'd practiced this testimony 100 times, which she had. I arrived home at approximately 11:40 p.m. Marcus's car was in the parking lot, which surprised me because he'd told me he would be at a business dinner in Colorado Springs and wouldn't be home until after midnight. I remember feeling confused but also relieved. I'd had a hard shift and I was looking forward to seeing him. Marcus kept his face carefully neutral, but inside his mind was racing. His alibi, the business dinner, how was Sarah going to attack his alibi when 3 people had confirmed he was there? I entered our apartment using my key, Sarah continued. The lights were off except for a lamp in the living room. I called out for Marcus but he didn't answer. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and went to get a glass of water. That's when I noticed the phone on the kitchen table. Harmon held up an evidence bag containing a cell phone. Is this the phone you noticed? Yes. It was Marcus's phone, or what I thought was Marcus's phone. He had 2 phones actually, I learned later. A personal phone and a work phone. But I'd never seen this particular phone before. It was sitting on the table and the screen was on. I could see text messages on the screen. What did the messages say? Harmon asked. Sarah's voice remained steady. They were from someone named Amanda. The most recent message said, "Is it done yet? I'm waiting at the location." And before that, there were other messages discussing timing, discussing insurance policies, discussing me. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Patricia Chen's hand flew to her mouth. I picked up the phone to read more, Sarah said, and that's when Marcus came out of the bedroom. He was wearing all black, black pants, black long-sleeved shirt, black gloves. In all the time we'd lived together, I'd never seen him wear gloves inside our apartment. What happened next? Harmon prompted. He saw me holding the phone and his expression changed. I've never seen Marcus look like that before. His eyes went completely cold. He didn't say anything at first. He just started walking toward me very calmly, very deliberately. And I just knew something terrible was about to happen. Sarah's voice finally wavered slightly, the clinical detachment cracking as she returned to that moment in her mind. I tried to run, but our apartment is small and he was between me and the front door. I backed into the kitchen looking for something to defend myself with. I grabbed a knife from the block on the counter, but Marcus knocked it out of my hand. It skittered across the floor. In the moment before death, time doesn't slow down, it crystallizes. Every detail becomes hyper-real, every sense heightened because some part of your soul knows these might be your last experiences on Earth. Sarah's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand as she continued, her knuckles white with tension. In the gallery, Patricia Chen was openly weeping, but Sarah couldn't look at her mother. If she did, she might not be able to continue. Marcus grabbed me by the shoulders and slammed me against the refrigerator, Sarah said, her voice dropping lower. I tried to scream, but he put his hand over my mouth. He was so much stronger than me. I'm 5'4" and weigh about 120 pounds. Marcus is 6'2" and weighs over 200 pounds. I didn't have a chance. Prosecutor Harmon moved closer, her voice gentle. Take your time, Miss Chin. I know this is difficult. Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. He dragged me down to the kitchen floor. I was fighting him, scratching at his face, his arms, anywhere I could reach. That's why he was wearing the long sleeves and gloves. He'd planned ahead. He knew I would fight back, and he didn't want to have any marks on him that would show up in photos at his alibi dinner. Marcus felt Richard Dawson stiffen beside him. The alibi, Sarah was about to destroy his carefully constructed alibi. Marcus got on top of me, pinning me down with his weight, Sarah continued, her voice becoming mechanical again, as if she was reading from a medical report rather than describing her own attempted murder. He put both hands around my throat and started to squeeze. As a nurse, I knew exactly what was happening to my body. The pressure on my carotid arteries was cutting off blood flow to my brain. I had maybe 15 seconds before I would lose consciousness. The courtroom was so silent that people could hear their own heartbeats. I tried everything I'd learned in the self-defense class I took in nursing school. I tried to gouge his eyes, but he turned his head away. I tried to hit his throat, but my arms were weakening as oxygen deprivation set in. I could feel my vision starting to tunnel, black spots appearing at the edges. The last thing I remember thinking was that I hoped my death would be quick, and that my mom wouldn't suffer too much. Patricia's sobs grew louder. Thomas had to physically hold her upright as her legs threatened to give out. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was Marcus's face above me. He wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional at all. He was just focused, like he was completing a task on a checklist. That was almost worse than the violence itself, the complete absence of any humanity in his eyes. Sarah paused, taking a sip of water that the bailiff provided. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the cup, the first real sign of the emotional toll this testimony was taking. The next thing I remember is waking up in complete darkness. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't move my arms or legs very much. I was in some kind of confined space. My throat hurt so badly I couldn't swallow without pain. My head was pounding from the oxygen deprivation. And I couldn't breathe properly, the air was thick and hot and limited. Agent Linda Torres stood and approached with another evidence bag, this one containing what appeared to be a large plastic storage container with a crude hole torn in one corner. "Is this the container you woke up in?" Harmon asked. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "It's a heavy-duty storage container, the kind used for moving or storage. Marcus had put me inside it while I was unconscious. He'd secured the lid with duct tape around all the edges. I later learned that he'd designed it to be airtight. I was supposed to suffocate in there if the strangulation hadn't killed me." Marcus's jaw clenched. She wasn't supposed to wake up. She wasn't supposed to wake up. That was the thought running through his mind on a loop. He checked her pulse. She'd been dead. He was certain she'd been dead. I was disoriented and terrified, Sarah said. I could feel that I was moving. The container was in a vehicle, and from the sound and motion I could tell it was a truck. Marcus's truck. I could hear him talking on the phone, though his voice was muffled through the plastic. Could you make out what he was saying? Harmon asked. Some of it. He said something like, I'm on my way. It took longer than expected, but it's done. She's secured. And then he laughed, actually laughed, and said, by the time anyone finds anything, we'll be long gone with the money. The word "we" hung in the air like a guillotine blade. That's when I realized this wasn't a crime of passion, Sarah said, her voice hardening. This was premeditated. This was planned. And Marcus wasn't working alone. Evil loves company. Because one person's conscience might eventually crack, but two people can reinforce each other's depravity, convincing themselves that together they're not monsters, they're partners. I was in that container for what I later calculated was about 2 hours, Sarah continued. At first I panicked completely. I screamed even though it hurt my damaged throat. I banged on the sides of the container even though I knew no one would hear me. I used up precious oxygen in my panic. Her voice took on a note of something that might have been pride. But then my medical training kicked in. I forced myself to calm down. Panic uses oxygen faster. I needed to think clearly if I was going to survive. Prosecutor Harmon nodded encouragingly. What did you do? I felt around the inside of the container systematically, using my hands to map every surface. The container was about 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. I had maybe 6 inches of clearance above my body. I was lying on my side because there wasn't room to straighten out completely. Sarah's clinical description made the horror even more visceral. Several people in the gallery looked ill. I found something that gave me hope. A small weakness in one of the corners where the duct tape hadn't adhered completely to the plastic. There was maybe a 1/4-inch gap. I could feel slightly cooler air coming through. That meant the seal wasn't perfect, which meant I might not suffocate immediately. She demonstrated with her hands, showing how she'd worked at that corner. I used my fingernails to try to widen the gap. My nails broke. My fingertips bled. But slowly, over what must have been an hour, I managed to create a hole about the size of a quarter. It was just enough to get more air, to see tiny glimpses of light from outside. Detective Morrison was taking notes rapidly, his face a mixture of horror and professional fascination. This level of detail was going to be crucial for the prosecution. Through that hole I could see that it was nighttime. I could see stars occasionally when the truck turned. And I could see that we were on a mountain road. I recognized the distinctive guardrails they use in the national forests. That told me we were probably heading into the Rockies. What did you think was going to happen? Harmon asked gently. Sarah's voice didn't waver. I knew he was going to bury me. That was the only logical conclusion. He thought I was dead and he was taking my body somewhere remote to dispose of it. I had a very limited window to save myself, whatever time it took him to reach his destination and open that container. The courtroom was riveted. This wasn't just testimony, it was a survival story that defied belief. I kept working at the hole, making it bigger. Eventually, I got it large enough that I could see more clearly. I could see the back of Marcus's head through the truck's rear window. I could see that we were on a dirt road, going very slowly, the truck bouncing over rough terrain. Sarah's face hardened. And then the truck stopped. I heard the engine turn off. I heard Marcus get out. And I heard a second voice, a woman's voice, saying, "You're late. I've been waiting for over an hour." Patricia Chen's gasp was audible throughout the courtroom. A woman? Marcus had an accomplice who was a woman? Through my hole I could see them. Marcus and a woman I'd never seen before. She was tall, blonde, maybe in her mid-30s. She was wearing hiking clothes and work gloves. And she was standing next to a pile of what looked like concrete mix bags and digging tools. The implication was clear. They'd been preparing Sarah's grave site in advance. The woman walked up to Marcus and kissed him. Not a friendly kiss, a romantic kiss. And she said, "Is our problem solved?" And Marcus said, "Yeah. She's in the container. No pulse, no breathing. I made sure this time." The phrase "this time" sent a chill through everyone listening. This time? Had there been other times? Other victims? That's when I realized something that made everything even more terrifying, Sarah said. The woman called Marcus baby and said, once we get rid of her, we can file the claim and finally be free. And Marcus responded by calling her Amanda and saying he loved her. Richard Dawson closed his eyes. His client was finished. Absolutely finished. Amanda? Prosecutor Harmon repeated for emphasis. The same Amanda whose text messages you saw on Marcus's secret phone? Yes. And I realized in that moment that Marcus hadn't just tried to kill me on impulse. He'd been planning this with someone else, with Amanda. And it had something to do with an insurance claim. Sarah's voice grew stronger, fueled by the anger that had sustained her through 6 months of hiding and preparing. I also realized something else that made me decide to fight instead of accept my death. The woman, Amanda, she seemed familiar. I couldn't place her at first, but then I remembered. She'd been at the hospital where I work. Not as a patient or a visitor. She'd been in the administrative offices going through records. I'd seen her twice, maybe 3 weeks before Marcus attacked me. This new detail made Agent Torres sit up straighter. If Amanda had been researching Sarah at the hospital, it suggested a level of planning that went far beyond a simple murder plot. What happened next, Miss Chin? Harmon asked. Sarah's jaw set with determination. I decided I was going to survive. And more than that, I decided I was going to make absolutely certain that Marcus and Amanda paid for what they'd done. Not just to me but to whoever else they might have hurt. Survival isn't just about staying alive. Sometimes it's about staying alive long enough to make sure your killers face justice. And sometimes that requires becoming something other than a victim, becoming a warrior. Marcus opened the back of his truck. Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the trauma she was recounting. I could hear the tailgate lowering. I could hear them talking as they prepared to move me. Amanda said something about making sure the concrete would set properly, that they needed to pour it tonight before the weather changed. She paused, taking another sip of water. Every eye in the courtroom remained fixed on her. I positioned myself as best I could inside the container. I had one chance, one single opportunity when they opened the lid. I'd managed to make my hole larger, big enough that I'd been able to reach my hand through and grab something from the truck bed. A rock about the size of a baseball, probably used as a wheel chalk. Agent Torres produced another evidence bag, this one containing a blood-stained rock roughly 4 inches in diameter. Is this the rock? Harmon asked. Yes. I could see dried blood on it. My blood from my torn fingertips and later Marcus's blood. I held that rock and I waited. My body was cramped and in pain. My throat was damaged and I could barely breathe. But I was alive and I was angry and I was not going to let them bury me. The courtroom was utterly silent except for Patricia's quiet sobbing. I heard Marcus say, "Help me lift it out. We'll open it at the grave to make sure she's positioned right." They lifted the container. I felt myself being moved. Through my hole I could see stars above us. Beautiful stars. I remember thinking that if these were the last stars I ever saw, at least I'd fought. Sarah's voice caught for just a moment before she steadied herself. They carried me maybe 20 feet. I could hear their footsteps crunching on dirt and pine needles. Then they set the container down hard. Amanda said, "Open it carefully. We don't want any forensic evidence on our clothes." And Marcus laughed and said, "She's dead, Amanda. Dead people don't leave evidence." The casual cruelty in those words made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. Marcus started cutting through the duct tape with a knife. I could hear the blade slicing through it, getting closer and closer to freeing the lid. I positioned the rock in my right hand, even though my fingers were so damaged they could barely grip it. I took the deepest breath I could manage with my injured throat. Sarah's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline of that moment flooding back through her body. The lid came off. Suddenly I could see the night sky clearly, a full moon, millions of stars. Marcus was leaning over the container, his face about 2 feet from mine. For 1 second we made eye contact. I saw his expression change from casual confidence to absolute shock. His mouth opened to say something. Her voice hardened. I didn't let him speak. I swung that rock with every ounce of strength I had left. I aimed for his temple just like they taught us in nursing school when learning about vulnerable points of the skull. The rock connected with a sound I'll never forget, a wet crack that I knew meant I'd done serious damage. Marcus unconsciously touched his temple, where a small scar remained from that night. In the courtroom, people leaned forward, completely absorbed in Sarah's testimony. Marcus went down. He dropped like his strings had been cut, falling backward onto the ground. Amanda screamed. I used the last of my strength to push myself up out of that container. Every muscle in my body was cramped and weak, but pure survival instinct took over. The human body is capable of impossible things when death is the only alternative. Adrenaline can make a dying person into a force of nature. And rage, righteous, justified rage, can fuel miracles. I fell out of the container onto the ground, Sarah continued. My legs wouldn't support me at first. They'd been cramped in that confined space for hours. Amanda was standing about 10 feet away, frozen in shock. She was staring at me like I was a ghost, which I suppose in a way I was. Sarah's voice took on a harder edge. Then Amanda's shock turned to action. She grabbed a shovel that was lying near the grave they'd dug. Yes, they'd already dug my grave. A hole about 6 feet deep and 7 feet long. I could see the pile of dirt beside it, the concrete mix bags stacked nearby, everything prepared for my burial. Prosecutor Harmon held up crime scene photos showing exactly what Sarah described. A grave prepared in a remote forest location, surrounded by equipment and supplies. Amanda came at me with that shovel raised like a weapon. She was yelling something about how I should be dead, how this wasn't supposed to happen. I rolled to the side and the shovel hit the ground where my head had been a second before. The impact sent up a spray of dirt and pine needles. Sarah demonstrated with her hands, showing how she'd moved, how close she'd come to being bludgeoned to death. Marcus was still on the ground, but I could see him starting to move. Blood was running down the side of his face from where I'd hit him. I knew I didn't have much time, maybe seconds, before he recovered enough to come after me. Her voice dropped lower, more intense. I grabbed the shovel from Amanda. I don't know where I found the strength. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was the absolute certainty that if I didn't fight, I would die in that forest. We struggled over it. She was taller than me and probably stronger under normal circumstances, but I had desperation on my side. Detective Morrison was writing furiously, documenting every detail. This was self-defense, clearly, but the specifics would matter in court. I got the shovel away from her and swung it like a baseball bat. It hit her in the shoulder and she went down, screaming. Then I ran. I just ran. I didn't know where I was going. I couldn't see a road or any lights. I just knew I had to get away from them. Sarah's breathing had quickened with the memory, her body reliving the panic of that moment. Behind me, I could hear Amanda yelling at Marcus to get up, to go after me. I heard Marcus groaning, saying something I couldn't make out. I crashed through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I had no shoes, they'd come off at some point. My feet were being cut by rocks and sticks. My throat was still so damaged I couldn't scream even if I'd wanted to. She looked down at her hands, which bore faint scars from that night. I ran for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. I kept expecting to hear them chasing me, to feel hands grabbing me from behind. Every shadow looked like Marcus. Every sound was Amanda coming to finish what they'd started. Patricia Chen was holding on to Thomas so tightly her knuckles were white. To hear what her daughter had endured was almost unbearable. Finally, I saw lights through the trees. Not bright lights, but the dim glow of what I thought might be a road. I pushed myself toward it, my body running on nothing but willpower at that point. I emerged from the forest onto a 2-lane highway. Route 7, I learned later. I was about 40 miles northwest of Boulder, deep in Roosevelt National Forest. When you're running for your life in the dark, every tree becomes a potential killer, every sound a potential threat. The forest isn't peaceful when you're prey. It's an accomplice to your would-be murderers, hiding them in shadows while exposing you in moonlight. I stood on the side of that highway, Sarah said, her voice growing softer, and I didn't know what to do. I was barefoot, covered in blood and dirt, my throat so swollen I could barely breathe. My clothes were torn. I probably looked like an extra from a horror movie. A small, bitter smile crossed her face. I was also terrified to flag down help, because for all I knew, Marcus and Amanda were already driving that same highway looking for me. I didn't know what their truck looked like from the outside. I didn't know if they had access to other vehicles. Every car that passed could have been them. Prosecutor Harmon nodded sympathetically. So what did you do? I hid in the trees just off the road watching cars pass. I was trying to decide if I should risk flagging someone down or if I should just start walking until I found a police station or a building with people. I was going into shock. My body was starting to shut down from the trauma and cold and blood loss. Sarah's voice wavered. Then I saw headlights approaching from the north. A big truck, an 18-wheeler. Something about it felt safer than the cars. Maybe because it was so visible, so public. A commercial truck would have GPS tracking, logging systems, company oversight. It would be harder for Marcus to intercept. She took a deep breath. I stepped out onto the shoulder of the road and raised my arms. The truck's air brakes hissed as it slowed down. I could see the driver's face in the cab, an older man, maybe 60, with gray hair and a beard. He was staring at me with an expression of shock and concern. Agent Torres stood. Your Honor, we have a witness who can corroborate Miss Chen's account. Bill Rodriguez, the truck driver who found her, is present in the courtroom today. A man stood from the back row, indeed an older man with gray hair and a beard, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. His eyes were fixed on Sarah with what looked like fatherly concern. Mr. Rodriguez found Miss Chen on Route 7 at approximately 3:17 a.m. on March 15, 2024, Torres continued. His truck's GPS and dash camera confirmed the time and location. We have video footage of Miss Chen emerging from the woods and flagging him down. The mention of video evidence sent a ripple through the courtroom. Marcus's face, which had regained some color, went pale again. There was video? Video of Sarah alive? Escaped, time-stamped and GPS confirmed? Mr. Rodriguez, Sarah said, looking at the truck driver with genuine warmth, saved my life in more ways than one. He could have driven past me. He could have assumed I was dangerous or unstable. But he stopped. Sarah continued her testimony. When Mr. Rodriguez got out of his truck, the first thing he said was, "Jesus Christ, what happened to you?" He took off his jacket and wrapped it around me. He had to support me because my legs finally gave out completely. Bill Rodriguez nodded from the back, confirming her account, his eyes glistening with emotion. He wanted to call 911 immediately, but I begged him not to. I was terrified that if an ambulance came, if police came, Marcus would find out somehow. I know now that sounds paranoid, but at that moment, I was convinced that if Marcus knew I was alive, he would find a way to finish what he started. This was the crucial part of the testimony, why Sarah had stayed hidden for 6 months. Prosecutor Harmon asked gently, "What did you ask Mr. Rodriguez to do instead?" I asked him to take me as far away from Boulder as possible. I told him someone had tried to kill me and that I needed to disappear until I could figure out what to do. Mr. Rodriguez, Bill, he didn't ask a lot of questions. He just said, "I'm heading to Grand Junction. That's about 4 hours from here. Will that work?" Sarah's voice softened with gratitude. He put me in his truck, gave me water and a blanket, and drove. He didn't push me to talk. He just drove and occasionally asked if I was okay. When we got to Grand Junction, he took me to a woman's shelter he knew about. He gave me $500 cash from his wallet. He wrote down his phone number and said if I ever needed help, to call him. Several people in the courtroom were wiping their eyes. In a story full of evil, Bill Rodriguez represented a moment of pure human kindness. The shelter took me in, no questions asked, no ID required. They got me medical attention. A doctor who worked with domestic violence survivors came and examined me. She documented all my injuries. The strangulation damage to my throat. The cuts and bruises all over my body. The damage to my fingers from clawing at the container. Everything. In our darkest moments, when monsters have shown us the worst of humanity, sometimes a stranger shows us the best. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of a truck driver who chooses to see a person in need instead of a problem to avoid. The shelter connected me with a victim's advocate named Rebecca Winters, Sarah continued. Rebecca specialized in helping victims of violent crimes, particularly women who'd escaped attempted murder. She understood why I didn't want to go to the police right away. Prosecutor Harmon produced documents. Your Honor, we have statements from Rebecca Winters, as well as medical documentation from Dr. Susan Palmer, who treated Miss Chen at the shelter. All of this corroborates Miss Chen's timeline and injuries. Judge Wells examined the documents briefly. Continue, Miss Chen. Rebecca helped me think clearly for the first time since the attack. She explained that I had options. I could go to the police immediately, which might result in Marcus's arrest. But she also explained the challenges. I had no physical evidence linking Marcus to the attack site because I'd fled without grabbing anything. My word against his. His alibi for that night appeared solid. He would claim I'd run away or that someone else had attacked me. Sarah's voice grew stronger, more determined. But more importantly, Rebecca pointed out something I hadn't fully processed yet. Marcus hadn't acted alone. Amanda was involved. And they'd mentioned insurance claims, which suggested a larger conspiracy. If I surfaced immediately, we might catch Marcus, but we might never prove the full extent of the plot. Amanda might escape justice entirely. This was the key strategic decision that had kept Sarah hidden for 6 months. The understanding that catching a killer was one thing, but dismantling an entire conspiracy required patience and evidence gathering. Rebecca connected me with the FBI. Agent Torres came to Grand Junction to interview me. She recorded everything, my testimony, my injuries, my description of events. She believed me, which was something I desperately needed at that moment. Agent Torres nodded from her position near the prosecutor's table. Agent Torres explained that Marcus and Amanda had likely done this before. The sophistication of their plan, the prepared burial site, Amanda's comment about making sure, this time, it all suggested a pattern. She asked if I would be willing to stay hidden while the FBI investigated. She explained it would be hard, that I would have to let my family think I was dead, that I might have to stay in hiding for months. Patricia Chen let out a sob at these words. 6 months of believing her daughter was dead when Sarah had been alive the whole time. The pain of that knowledge was written across her face. I said yes, Sarah said firmly, because I knew that if I surfaced too early, Marcus would adjust his story. He would find a way to explain away the evidence. But if he thought I was dead, if he thought he'd gotten away with it, he might get cocky. He might make mistakes. And most importantly, the FBI could investigate the insurance fraud angle without tipping off Marcus and Amanda. Prosecutor Harmon held up a thick folder. Your Honor, what Miss Chen didn't know at the time was that her decision to wait would uncover something far more sinister than even she suspected. The FBI's investigation, based on information Sarah provided, revealed that Marcus Bennett and Amanda Bennett, yes, they were married despite Marcus claiming to be divorced, had been running an elaborate insurance fraud and murder scheme for years. The courtroom exploded with murmurs. Marcus closed his eyes, his face a mask of defeat. Richard Dawson was already calculating how to possibly plea bargain his way out of multiple murder charges. During the 6 months Miss Chen was in hiding, Harmon continued, she wasn't just waiting. She was actively helping the FBI build their case. She underwent extensive debriefings. She helped agents locate the burial site in Roosevelt National Forest. She provided details about Marcus's habits, his friends, his work associates that helped investigators piece together his movements and find Amanda. Sarah picked up the narrative. I also started remembering things, details I hadn't thought were important before. Like how Marcus had asked me to sign some papers 6 months before the attack. Papers he said were for refinancing our apartment lease. I'd sign them without reading them carefully because I trusted him. I didn't know until the FBI investigation that those papers were actually a marriage license and insurance applications. Trust is a weapon when placed in the wrong hands. We sign papers for the people we love, never imagining those signatures might be signing our own death warrants. And killers know this. They weaponize our love, our trust, our assumption that the person we sleep beside couldn't possibly want us dead. Sarah Chen thought she'd escaped death. She thought testifying would bring justice. She thought her nightmare was over. She was wrong. What started as one woman's attempted murder has exploded into something far more sinister, A potential serial killer operating for over a decade, multiple victims buried across 5 states, and Marcus Bennett's chilling claim that he's part of a network of killers who share techniques and protect each other. Is Marcus Bennett telling the truth about a network of killers? How many more victims are buried in unmarked graves across America? Will Sarah Chin ever truly be safe from the monster who tried to bury her alive? And who else is involved in this conspiracy? Drop your predictions in the comments right now. Do you think Marcus is lying about a network, or is this bigger than anyone imagined? This case has shocked investigators, devastated families, and exposed a level of evil that most people can't even comprehend. A boyfriend who murdered multiple women for insurance money. A wife who helped plan the killings. A network that might span the entire country. But this is only part 1 of Sarah Chen's story. In part 2, we'll dive deep into the FBI's investigation. We'll learn about the other victims, who they were, how they were targeted, and whether their families will finally get the closure they've been desperately seeking for years. We'll find out if Marcus Bennett's claims about a killer network are real or just the desperate lies of a man facing life in prison. And most importantly, we'll discover what happens when Sarah Chin comes face to face with Amanda Bennett, the woman who helped plan her murder and is still out there, still dangerous, still free. If you want to know what happens next, and trust me, you need to know what happens next, then click on that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Hit that like button if Sarah's courage inspired you. Share this video to spread awareness about insurance fraud schemes and domestic violence. And comment, "Justice for Sarah," if you believe she's the bravest woman you've ever heard of. Remember, this isn't just a true crime story. This is a story about survival, about courage, about refusing to let evil win. Sarah Chin was supposed to be dead. Instead, she's alive and fighting to make sure no other woman suffers what she suffered.